It would please me, and I imagine it would please you as well, if we spent our time together talking about that verse that I know caught your attention. Because I've been at this long enough to know what subjects interest church people. And one of those subjects is heaven. What happens when we die? What's this business in the creed about the resurrection of the body? What's the Bible say about the afterlife? And in this passage, Paul gives us a classic heaven verse when he says, we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. Now, I imagine the other reason you would be happy for us to spend some time on this is because you've heard me over these last 4 years say again and again and again that the goal of the Christian life is not to become disembodied souls in heaven. But you're thinking, isn't that exactly what Paul is talking about here? So perhaps I have some explaining to do. And it would give me great pleasure to do it, and I would imagine give you some pleasure as well. The other reason it would be fun to spend some time talking about heaven is then that would allow us to avoid the real thrust of these few verses that Beth read. Because this bit about heaven is just a setup. Paul is not writing doctrine here. He's not trying to give a systematic account of the afterlife. And so to follow that rabbit trail would be to miss the point by a long shot. No, Paul is being rhetorical here by setting up a contrast between things that matter less and something that matters a lot. It's a bona fide rhetorical strategy he learned from the Stoics. It's as if he's saying, well, if we got to choose between continuing on in this daily life here and now, what he calls life in the body, life here and now, or between that and this daily life coming to an end and our going immediately into God's presence, well, if I had my choice, since things have been kind of rough for me lately, I'd choose the latter and go on and be with God. He's suggesting something about which it's okay for us to have a preference. Would you rather have this or would you rather have that? Would you rather go to Mexican for dinner tonight or would you rather go to Chinese for dinner tonight? Would you rather get a burrito at Torrero's tonight or would you rather get a burrito at Bandito's tonight? Would you rather root for Duke or UNC or NC State? These are things about which it's okay for us to have a preference because, believe it or not, they don't matter that much. And Paul is setting up a contrast here between something that doesn't matter as much, whether we would prefer to continue in this life or go on and be with the Lord, and something that matters crucially. That is, do our lives please God? So he says, whether we're at home or away, we make it our aim to please God. Pleasing the Lord is the crucial matter under which all other matters fall. And it's also the subject I'd be happy to avoid. Because it's a lot easier to talk about heaven. It's easier to think and to talk about an abstract subject like the afterlife than it is to think and talk about whether our lives here and now, our daily lives in the body, as Paul says, are pleasing to the Lord. Here's the reason it's not so easy for me personally to talk about pleasing the Lord. Even though that's biblical language, it's not the most natural language for me to use to talk about our relationship with God, because it's so prone to misunderstanding. I see in my job very often how destructive it can be in people's lives for them to try to live in order to please other people. I can never make you happy. Have you ever said that before? Nothing I do can please you. I've tried for 30 years and I can't make you happy. I have seen how diminishing and destructive it can be to live our lives trying to please others. I remember talking to a 60-year-old woman once, and she was telling me how nervous she would get when her own 85-year-old mother would come to visit, because she was so afraid that she wouldn't please her by putting the pot of beans on the table instead of putting the beans in a bowl, by putting the jar of mustard on the table instead of putting the mustard into a little dish, by putting the bag of bread on the table instead of putting the bread on a plate, and with tears in her eyes. She said to me, "Why am I still so afraid? Why am I still trying to please her?" So much of our need to please others, to keep others happy, comes from both misdirected priorities and real insecurities about who we are. Misdirected priorities, vain ambition, right? We got to keep the higher-ups happy, or else we won't be able to climb the ladder. But more likely, the anxiety that we actually won't be loved or accepted as we are, or the fear that we will be rejected. And so we live out of those insecurities and fears. Someone recently told me a story about an incident that happened in their Midwest United Methodist Church a few weeks ago. The preacher always preaches from a center platform up in front of the altar, and he has his sermon notes on a music stand. And his family always sits in about the fifth row, his wife and his high school-aged daughter and his 6-year-old son, Michael. Michael has a little trouble sitting still. Michael's a 6-year-old boy, go figure. Well, on this Sunday morning, the preacher was preaching, and he got into his sermon, and then he looked up and he said, "Michael, sit still." And then he continued a little in his sermon and said, "Michael, sit still." And then a few more minutes passed, and he stopped his sermon and walked down the steps and grabbed Michael's arm, dragged him up the steps, and sat him down next to the music stand facing the congregation for the rest of the sermon. Now, friends, when that's our image of what we have to please, of pleasing someone, our family, our friends, the boss who's waiting to check our quarterly figures to see if we've met our goal, when that's the picture of what it means to please someone, so we spend our lives living a life that's not our own in order to keep someone else happy, then it doesn't sound like much fun to put the Lord on the list. With all of the other people I have to keep happy, you mean I've got to think about pleasing the Lord too? I don't know about you, but I'd rather talk about heaven. What do you think happens when we die? What we need is a different picture of pleasing in order to dislodge this other one. If you're ever browsing in the poetry section at Barnes & Noble, there's a good chance that you'll find a volume of poetry by Mary Oliver, because she's one of our most prolific poets and one of our best. And if you're lucky, you'll pick up a volume and you'll come across this poem called "When the Roses Speak, I Pay Attention." Here's what the roses say to the poet. "As long as we are able to be extravagant, we will be hugely and damply extravagant. Then we will drop foil by foil to the ground, This is our unalterable task, and we do it joyfully. And then Oliver ends the poem this way. Their fragrance, all the while rising from their blind bodies, making me spin with joy. How about that for a picture of pleasing, a picture of delight? The roses doing exactly what they were meant to do, exactly what they were made to do, living into their unalterable task of being extravagantly beautiful, and the poet watching, smelling, spinning with joy. How's that for a picture of delight? What we need is a new picture of pleasing, to dislodge that old one. You're a grandfather, bouncing your 2-year-old granddaughter on your knee. She is so easy to please. All you have to do is be your goofy old self. No sham, no pretense, just you. How simple to bounce her on your knee. And who knew someone could take such joy in you? Just you. When was the last time someone took this kind of delight in you? Just you. You're bouncing her on your knee. The game is over. She climbs off the knee and then turns and looks at you and says with that giggly voice of hers, "Hooray! Do it again! Do it again!" An alternative picture of delight. And I wonder, can we allow this new picture of delight to nudge out those old ones? The picture of the boss checking the quarterly figures, the picture of the preacher dad telling you to sit still, the picture of the dour-faced God shaking his head once again in disappointment because you have failed to please. Can this new picture push out the old one so that we can imagine this possibility that our lives, here and now, our daily lives in the body, as Paul says, that our lives might give God such delight, might make God spin with joy, not because we've done something heroic or extraordinary, but because we've been our goofy old selves, because we're learning to live in that unalterable task of being us. Can we imagine that simply living the lives we were given to live might make God squeal with joy? That living that life, not the fearful, anxious, false, pleasing self of a life, but the life God intended us to live. The life God blessed us with and endowed us with from the beginning, not someone else's life, not the life someone else would have written for us if it was their job, but the life God has given us. That life might make God spin with joy. Can you imagine that? Because that's exactly the possibility that Paul thinks Jesus has made possible. For later on in the passage, Paul writes, "If anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. The old things have passed away. Behold," he says, "all things have become new." Think about that. The old things have passed away. The old false self, the old pleasing self, the anxious, fearful self has passed away. The mask of fear, the fear above all else of not living up to someone else's expectations or God's, that fear is dissolving, dying with Christ, so that the new, true self, the self God gave you with to begin with, can rise. The self that makes God spin with joy. and not rise in some distant heaven, but rise here and now, today, in our daily lives, in the body. How about that? Your life. A new picture of delighting God. So when we have this new picture of pleasing the Lord, then maybe we can rehabilitate the phrase, put it back into use. Maybe we can bring the phrase back into our lives or into our church, because it no longer oppresses us or drains us, but it gives us hope. Hope we can live in this new creation as those ones we are meant to be. I've been thinking this week about the Stephen ministers we commissioned last week. Stephen ministers, those folks who have gotten a lot of training in order to care for people who are going through periods of struggle. You might not have seen it, but after they kneeled at this altar rail and so many people laid hands on them and prayed for them, when they stood up and turned around, they had tears streaming down their cheeks. And I believe these were tears of joy because they have found a way of serving, a way of living into their Christian vocation that is deeply congruent with who God made them to be. They didn't endure 50 hours of training, I hope, because one day they said, well, we got to do something to please God, might as well be this. No. But because they discovered who they were and who they could be and what they could do, and it's bringing them joy and it's bringing God joy as well. I've been thinking about those high school graduates we celebrated 2 weeks ago. What if one of them took this new picture of delighting God with them to college in the fall? Let it replace that old picture of success and ambition to please someone. That picture that is always suggesting to them, you're really doing this for someone else, you know. No, this new picture of delighting God, what if they took that with them this fall? Maybe then when the voice of vocation started to speak to them from within, they could listen to it. And maybe even say, yes, I'll be a teacher and give my life for kids, even though teachers don't get paid what they're worth and are often society's scapegoats. Yes, I'll be a teacher. Yes, I'll be a social worker and spend my life relating to and helping the poor in our society, even though there's not even a ladder to climb in that field. Yes, I'll be a social worker. Yes, I'll be a preacher. Just a preacher, so I can share with other people this story of the Jesus who set me free so my life could delight God. Yes. I've been thinking about our church. What if we took this picture of delighting God and we took it into our church council meetings and our committee meetings and our task force meetings when we have to make decisions? Like, what will we spend our money on? What will we invest our money in? What new ministries will we support or start? What should we do with this big building we've got? So that we can ask, will this decision or will this new direction help us to be the church God made us to be? A church that makes God spin with joy. Because chances are, if it gives God joy, it will give us joy as well. This new picture is so freeing for me, and it's been more fun this week for me to think about than heaven. It's amazing to me that I could get to the end of my day or the end of my days and look back over my day, my hours, my words, my deeds, my thoughts, my daily life, my life, as Paul says, in the body. And at the end of this day, God might look at my day too, and then say to me in that giggly voice of hers, hooray, do it again. Amen.